The theme of this thread was weird stuff that your kids had said to you, or strange things that kind of made you go, hmm. And one of them was something like, Mommy, do you remember when I was your aunt?
Oh, wow. That's a good one.
No, and it's a Facebook listener whose name we know very well. I'm blanking on it right now, and I apologize. But that was kind of shocking, but also comforting, but also your child was telling you what to do. And you were probably being a jerk to them or a brat when you were growing up, and now you're getting it or whatever it is. It's just these roles switch around. So that's one of the principles of reincarnation, is that the people you deal with now, or maybe they passed through your life, had done that before in previous lives. You're all kind of mixed up in this together. That's the theme here. And on the other hand, maybe it's just the vivid imagination of a child, but pretty freaky, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah. So let me ask you this, Scott. Has your son or any child at all said something very odd to you like that?
You know, this is going to be a really flat story. I remember that he did, and I feel like I said this on the show too, or at least told you about it. He said something strange to me when he was much younger, which he's 10 now. When we started the show, he was 5. But I can't remember what it was now. But I remember thinking, well, that's odd. But it was just one thing, and it wasn't, really earth-shattering, but it was...
Right.
It was odd. Listen to this quote from page 350 of There Is a River, Thomas Segru's book, on, I guess, an interpretation of what Cayce had said about incarnation.
Mm-hmm.
The soul may occupy the body as early as 6 months before birth or as late as a month after birth, though in the latter case it's been hovering over the body since birth, deciding whether or not to occupy it. Once the decision is made and the occupation completed, the veil drops between the new personality and the soul, and the earthly record of the child begins.
Wow. Boy, that also just reminded me of it. I've never seen the show. It was Celebrity Ghost Stories. Celebrities come on and talk about it. And Scott and I were, just before we started recording, this little section here was talking about the case of Fred Dreyer, who was the star of the cop TV show Hunter.
Yes.
A couple of decades ago. And there was another one, again, I can't remember the name of the actor who was on there, but she was talking about seeing an apparition of a little boy in their house. And what it turned out to be was an image of her yet-to-be toddler son. And was making an appearance. And man, it was kind of on in the background. I didn't get to watch the show fully and digest it as I usually do, but I'd heard that type of story before about mothers specifically seeing a vision of the child that is yet to come in. And it's kind of like, she felt anyway, the actor who was talking about her story on the show, was that it was like the child was waiting in the wings, scoping the family out before it arrived. That's the gut feeling that she got. So
interesting.
Again, none of this is provable. It could all be overactive imaginations or pregnancy cravings, whatever you want to call it. But interesting that it ties in with this. But speaking of, There Is a River. In March of 1943, the book we've been mostly pulling from, as we've been saying over and over and over again, There Is a River by Thomas Segru, was published in a first edition. And again, this would be the only biography written while Cayce was alive and taken from interviewing the family directly, as Thomas Segru lived with them, I believe, while he was writing this book.
In recovery for his treatment of his arthritic condition by Cayce.
So we talked about him earlier. Yeah, so it was, and I think that's why it's looked to as the real main one if you want to know the life story very well, and just the facts, because it's taken from the guy who was there and really an embedded journalist with the family. Because of the popularity of the book, though, and a prominent profile article titled Miracle Man of Virginia Beach being printed in a widely known magazine at the time called Coronet, Cayce now received national attention once again when the activities of the ARE were previously going on quietly. They weren't making a lot of waves. They weren't trying to gain a lot of publicity for what they were doing. They just wanted to keep doing what they were doing. And those that were interested in what they were doing and wanted to participate would come to them. So they weren't making a big splash. They weren't trying to gain a ton of members. I think even Hugh Lynn narrowed down the mailing lists of those who were receiving the publications to only those who were really active and showing genuine interest in it. But what this did, though, with the book coming out and this big-time article, was that now the letters and pleas for help were flooding in. Extra staff had to be hired, and Gertrude had to bring home trunk loads of mail in her car from the post office because they wouldn't even deliver all that much mail to their house anymore. So that gives you an idea of how many letters were coming in. And Edgar Cayce, being who he was, he wanted to help everyone, and he was now doing 4 to 6 readings per day.
Yeah, so many families had loved ones that went missing in action during World War II and sought answers from Cayce as to what happened to them, and he felt like he couldn't let them down, so he increased his readings to 8 per day to try and keep up. This also took an incredible strain on Cayce's health. As he said, the readings were, as you can imagine, very emotionally draining to channel that pain and misery, and the process would leave him exhausted. The voice from the readings told Cayce directly that he was taking on too much and that if he didn't limit his sessions to just 2 per day, the extra workload would eventually kill him. He gave 1,345 readings in the 1-year period between June of 1943 to June of 1944, and by August of that year, he had completely collapsed from exhaustion. A reading was conducted to ask what he should do next, and the voice said that he should rest until he recuperated or he died. Edgar and Gertrude then decided to vacation in the mountains of West Virginia to convalesce. On September 17th of 1944, he gave his last reading to himself, and in that same month, he suffered a stroke. Edgar Cayce passed away on January 3rd, 1945, at the age of 67. He would be buried in Riverside Cemetery in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. 3 months later, his wife Gertrude Evans Cayce would pass away on Easter Sunday at the age of 65. And what's interesting is he predicted the day of his death, which we're going to talk about when we come to the prophecies.
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, the Association for Research and Enlightenment would carry on the work of cataloging and cross-referencing the entire collection of 14,306 files of readings that Cayce had given in his lifetime from a period of March 31st, 1901 to September 17th, 1944. And they're all available online in the members section of the website, as we said at the beginning of part 1. And they're also at the ARE Library in Virginia Beach. And just a small side note here as we conclude this section. I had read that as some research efforts have compiled and cross-referenced readings, they turn into narratives, or they form narratives if you put them all together about certain topics, such as the story of Atlantis, with the readings being given out of order. So what I mean here is that, as I described in parts 1 and 2 previously, that he would give a remedy to somebody and say, oh, by the way, you also had this problem when you were this person in a past life, and would name it. And that's, as I said with Al Lammers, those questions started to be more prevalent. And also later in life, when they decided to focus more on the metaphysical aspects, people would say, like, what do you mean by past life when I was this scribe in ancient Egypt? And the voice would go on to explain what that person did and what their role was. And that's an aspect of karma, perhaps, where things you were doing in past lives have come back to you, good and bad. And so, as he mentioned this, more questions were asked about things like Atlantis and as I said before, the story of Jesus and all these different narratives. And they form narratives. But my point here is that he didn't just sit down in one long session for 3 hours and tell the whole story of Atlantis beginning to end. It was coming out in snippets and various readings, and sometimes disjointed. So when the researchers went back at the ARE and they put this all together and put them in context in this narrative, I had read, and I'm not sure this is true, we didn't follow up on this, but none of the readings conflicted with other readings given, meaning they didn't contradict other readings. This all flowed into one narrative once you stuck them all together. Again, I had read that years and years ago, so I don't know if that's actually true, if that's just purported, and researchers have found out that that's not actually the case, but that's what I remember reading that very specifically and being impressed with that, shall we say, and that if he was doling out bits of a story that's really fantastical, of course, and most people would think his stories on the beginnings of the earth and Atlantis and all these other kinds of things, subjects in the metaphysical realm, are really just products of an overactive imagination, then he did a really good job memorizing this entire story and doling it out in little bits that he knew later on would be put together into a narrative. So yeah, just very strange if that is true, because it was doled out in a non-linear fashion. So again, if it was true, it'd be quite a feat for just somebody with a good sense of science fiction.
Well, we've done a lot of talking about Cayce and what he does in these readings and the medical advice and that angle on things. It turns out that's not the only thing he was known for. A lot of you that are already familiar with him will be probably wondering why we haven't brought up the prophecies yet.
Well, here's the fun part.
Yeah.
I mean, poultices and packs and, high compresses are
Tinctures,
fun.
poultices, salves. We didn't get to say salve. You can even make a salve.
I believe there are salves involved, yes. Minerals and essential oils, all that kind of good stuff. But here's the thing that people really gets them going.
Yes.
And it either you're on board with it and you find it fascinating. Like with me, I just think it's fascinating.
Well, it's interesting. And when it comes to prophecies, you have all these infamous folks from throughout time. I mean, the first person that comes to mind is Nostradamus.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I was younger, there was a series on TV of specials about Nostradamus, and they were so scary because it was all about the end of the world and nuclear holocaust.
Yeah.
Everyone was convinced when there was this really serious looming threat of the Cold War turning into World War III and a nuclear holocaust. Everyone was convinced that Nostradamus called it, and it was right around the corner, and we were all going to die. I remember having intense anxiety about that when I was in high school in the late 80s. Yeah. So,
you remember the In Search of episode on him with
yes.
you putting Leonard Nimoy on that, man, it just frightened you.
Creepy stuff. Yeah, and then
the Prince in the Blue Turban.
Yes, the Prince in the Blue. Oh, so much stuff about that. We should probably do a show on Nostradamus eventually. I'm going to save that for year 6, though. This is
okay.
This is year 6. Let's save it for year 7.
Are we counting them like that? Okay.
Yeah, I don't know.
Right.
We're in year 5, 6 now, right? Yeah, we're 5 years old.
Season 5. Yeah.
Anywho, let's get back to the prophecies. What is a prophecy? The prophecy, this is a definition online, foretelling or prediction of what is to come, something that is declared by a prophet, especially a divinely inspired utterance or revelation. So let's talk about Edgar Cayce's predictions about the future.
Well, again, to keep this in mind, the intelligence coming through him are making these predictions.
That's right. They're like, coming. He's asleep. He doesn't even remember it. Yeah.
It's just, I'm sorry. It's one of my favorite New Yorker cartoons where there's a panel of a guy, like an older boss guy, and he's got this big frown on his face, and then a younger employee, and he's got a hand puppet.
Yeah.
And the captain just says, "Surely you can't hold me responsible for what others might say." I didn't insult you. The puppet did.
The puppet did it.
Yeah. So you could say in this case that it's coming through him, or it's Cayce's genius sci-fi brain that's coming up with all this Isaac Asimov stuff or this dystopian future kind of stuff. But really, it's coming through him. So just keep that in mind as we hear this stuff. But it's really, like I said, it gets people going, or it gets his skeptics going, either that like, well, there you go, none of this stuff came true, or some did, or you have to interpret it, but it makes an impact on people, and that's what people really want to know. They want to know the future.
Well, let's drill down on some of these predictions. He made a lot of them over the years, and some of them came to pass, some didn't. We actually found a fascinating list of them on a website we've cited in the past because it's primarily dedicated to near-death experiences, and it is in fact called neardeath.com. There's a hyphen between near and death there if you want to go check it out, neardeath.com. And the webmaster is Kevin Williams. We have a link to it in our show notes. The readings that are on Kevin's website, though, or Mr. Williams' website, are actually from the Association for Research and Enlightenment, whom we've also been in touch with about our coverage of Mr. Cayce, and let them know that we were going to be using some material from their website, and they very graciously agreed to let us use that. So we want to give a shout out of thanks to them for sharing the audio with us that you heard earlier in the show, and also the text of some of these readings, which you're going to find fascinating.
One other thing I want to say before we get started here is that unlike the medical stuff, he didn't really go on about this. I know from the few readings that I've done on the readings, it wasn't mentioned unless it was part of the entity's past life. Like, oh, by the way, you also suffered from this when you were a monk in this age and in a past life, and you were doing this. Or in Cayce's own case, he was a scribe in the ancient Egyptian days. I think that's correct. That's from a long time ago when I was reading this stuff. And so he would mention these other things that were going on. And it wasn't until later, though, when people started getting off the medical questions, as we just told you about in his life narrative here, that they were starting to ask, like, oh, I guess you can ask other stuff. Well, where are their limits? So what are the secrets of the universe? What's my life purpose? How does this work? How does that work? What happened back then? And stuff like in really mystical, esoteric subjects. And for years, people had no idea that he could also give you answers through him about these other subjects. So that's what it is now. You wonder, like, why wasn't that question number 2? Like, thanks for curing me. By the way, how are the pyramids built?
Yeah.
People didn't think to ask that until like Al Lammers came around, and then it turned really metaphysical. That's why we wanted to make sure we included him in the narrative.
All right, so we're going to talk about some of these prophecies now. This is a combination of our own thoughts on the prophecies and also some of the observations that Mr. Williams made about them on neardeath.com. And these sources, just to remind everybody, they're all very favorable to Mr. Cayce, just to understand where we're at with confirmation bias. On the page that Mr. Williams created, there is a very comprehensive list of the prophecies that Cayce made and whether or not they've come to pass. Now, according to that list, which again comes from the Association for Research and Enlightenment, Mr. Cayce made at least 22 predictions that seemingly came true. I've cherry-picked a few of them because we don't have all night. We already made this show long enough, but these ones stood out to me. One of them was the stock market crash of 1929. In the mid-20s, he did over 700 readings on business and the stock market. And in February of 1925, he said the following in reading 2723-1. By the way, I'll be giving you the numbers for these readings in case we ever transcribe this episode to make it easy for you to track them. And it's my understanding that the first number corresponds to the person that the reading was given to, and the second number corresponds to the sequence of the reading for them. So this would have been person number 2723 that he had done a reading for, and their first reading. Here's that reading now. Hence, in the present sphere, we find these conditions in the urge of the individuality of the entity. One that within the present sphere will have great amount of monies to care for. In the adverse forces that will come then in 1929, care should be taken lest this, without the more discretion in small things, be taken from the entity. That was 4 years before the crash. And
so what it's saying is you watch out for your money here. You're going to have a good deal of money.
Yeah.
Make sure you protect that money because something's coming in 29.
Right. And these readings, by the way, were for clients that were asking about investments. Here, 2 years later, he warns of it again. This is reading 900-425. We may expect a considerable break and bear market. See, this issue being between those of the reserves of nations and of individuals, and will cause, unless another of the more stable banking conditions come to the relief, a great disturbance in financial circles. This warning has been given. See? ? I got hung up on a great disturbance in financial circles. It immediately took me to a great disturbance in the force. I was wondering if George Lucas was aping this reading for dialogue. But he's talking about the crash again, and this was in 1927, 2 years before the crash. The other thing that's really fascinating to me about this one, Forrest, is that he says unless in this, which implies the future is not set in stone, right?
Well, that will lead to, I guess there's a whole critiquing section here, but it's something, in case I forget, I like to mention these things because I never forget, and I hear the episode like, oh, I forgot to mention that. Not that anybody cares. But the idea is that one of the skeptics here, Joe Nickel, which we, beloved Joe Nickel, which we like to get the skeptical side from, would say that in some of these things that he's mentioning, he seems uncertain. The language is uncertain, like it may be or perhaps. And that's a point of criticism in that, well, you're not sure? Like, come on, you're omniscient. Let's nail this monkey business down 100%. Why are you uncertain? Why are you hesitant about perhaps it's this or maybe this will happen? And I could see that as a point where, well, he's hedging his bets. He doesn't want to, that way if it doesn't happen, he said, well, I said maybe,
Yeah.
Or I said perhaps this would happen. But I just don't think the future works like that, as we're going to see.
No, I think that's a very valid point. And I think you're onto something there when you are making clear that the skeptical viewpoint of the Cayce readings is, well, if this doesn't fit into this box of precision, then we must throw it all out. But the flip side of that is you do have to recognize when you are dealing with someone who is behaving fraudulently, but that comes back around to what portion of the data they're giving you is accurate. I mean, this is a pretty hard prediction of a stock market crash.
Hold on one second. I misspoke. That was actually magician James Randi that would say that Cayce was fond of expressions like, I feel that, and perhaps, and all these qualifying words, so he didn't have to make a positive declaration about anything. And we'll tackle what Joe Nickel had to say in our section dedicated for that. But I just want to point that out. Like, no, that was James Randi who said, well, he's giving himself some wiggle room.
Yes, that's the amazing Randi, who is a prominent skeptic himself and a magician. Well, that wasn't the only thing that Cayce predicted. He also predicted the rise and fall of Hitler. This is a particularly controversial reading when it comes to Cayce because he seemed to suggest that even Hitler could be swayed towards good if he could turn away from self-aggrandizement and imperialism. Now, this information that we're about to share was imparted to one of those study groups that Forrest mentioned started up after the university shut down. This was a group of folks that worked together to understand Cayce's readings and, as we said earlier, become more psychic. Now, the first one of these groups was formed in 1931. We have a description to a link of that on the website. Here is a description of the study groups from the arecatalog.com website, which we have a link to. In 1931, Edgar Cayce agreed to help a group of people grow spiritually and become more psychic with one condition. They would have to live the precepts. It took the group 11 years to apply and compile the 24 lessons that became A Search for God, Books 1 and 2. This material has helped individuals and groups around the world to discover a closer attunement to God. So that's a book that you can actually buy based on these experiences. And it was to one of these groups that this information came through about Hitler. I actually did not confirm whether or not it was this exact group or not. It may have been. But here we're citing a book entitled Edgar Cayce, An American Prophet. Now, this was written by Sidney D. Kirkpatrick, who we haven't mentioned yet in the series. It's a critically acclaimed account of Cayce from a more modern and thoroughly researched angle. Without getting too far into the weeds and all the opinions around that, there's something else about this particular reading that was bizarre. In chapter 45 of his book, Kirkpatrick details how Cayce suggested that global catastrophic events might be triggered by a, quote, young king, end quote, and that man would be Hitler from the country of Germany. Listen to this excerpt from that chapter of Kirkpatrick's book, An American Prophet. In this particular reading, which the reference number for is 3976-13, this is an infamous reading about Hitler. There's a lot of interesting information in this one. One of the things that Cayce talks about is the destruction of the planet. There's a lot of bad things going on. It's catastrophic kind of material where the earth is going to be broken up. Japan is going to, quote, go into the sea. There's a lot of predictions made for global geographic catastrophes, although it's not really specified how those will come to be. Here's a particular quote from that reading that I thought was interesting. Through those that in the inmost recesses of themselves awaken to the spiritual truths that are to be given, and those that have acted in the capacity of teachers among men, the rottenness of those that have ministered in places will be brought to light, and turmoils and strifes shall enter. Armageddon is at hand. So there's those last four words are particularly frightening. Armageddon is at hand. That's not something you want to hear from a guy predicting the future, or that you believe can predict the future. What's interesting about this particular passage is that in this reading, and I don't know if it's for the first time, I can't say that categorically, but the voice specified itself as an I instead of a we, which is what it usually was. Mm-hmm. It was always the we, which we've talked about in part 1 and part 2. But in this case, it was an I, and in this case, it revealed its identity to the people listening. Here's a further quote from the reading. The weakling, the unsteady, must enter into the crucible and become as naught, even as he, that they may know the way. I, Halaliel, have spoken. And going back to Kirkpatrick's book here that we cited a few minutes ago, this is his assessment of that. Kirkpatrick's book says about this, Halaliel suggested the mechanism that might trigger catastrophic events and bring material suffering on a troubled people. Halaliel said, quote, the young king will soon reign, end quote. The nation that would produce the young king was identified along with his name. The country was Germany. The king was Hitler. Kirkpatrick goes on to say, much has been said and written about the prophecies offered in this reading and about how many of these events actually came to pass. The shattering earth changes would not manifest themselves, and yet the reading was entirely accurate regarding Hitler's reign. Despite the major attention that has been paid this and Cayce's other prophetic readings, an important point has often been lost. The events foretold were ones that could potentially occur given the state of world affairs in January of 1934 when the reading was given. In trance, as in a waking state, Cayce repeatedly said that even the Lord of Lords could not accurately predict future events because man's will altered and defined the future. So here again, we come back to that unless thing that I mentioned earlier that stuck out to me in the prior reading, unless another of the more stable banking conditions comes to the relief. Man's will alters and defines the future. Cayce is reporting on a possible future. Is it the most likely one at the time of the reading? Is it meant to be a warning? Why, in the case of this particular reading, was it in the voice of this one individual, Halaliel? Halaliel, according to what we could find, is the archangel known as the Lord of Karma. Again, from Kirkpatrick's book, the overriding message in these readings was that the collective will of mankind and the extent of brotherly love in the world would determine whether or not there would be war. Back in 1933, when Adolf Hitler was Chancellor of Germany, before he had become Der Führer, Cayce gave perhaps his most controversial readings on this subject, suggesting that even Hitler had the potential to be a force for positive change in Europe if his personal will could be turned toward the brotherhood of man. By the way, I cannot get over it, and I'm not making light of this. There's a lot of parallels in this storyline and Darth Vader's storyline. I don't know what what's
Where
going
do you
on.
think they
You can turn him from the dark side. Yeah, exactly. So
but no, it's the classic story. That's what I'm saying, is that we all have a choice to use your powers for good or evil. That's why it's such a trope now of seeing somebody who's powerful that must make a decision. Either have earthly powers and do ill amongst your fellow men, or use those powers and your will for good things, which maybe not are as fun in an earthly sense.
Yeah.
But they're for the benefit of humankind.
Going back to Kirkpatrick, he points out that from the outset, the source tempered every positive statement about Hitler with qualifying clauses such as, quote, if imperialism does not enter in. By January 1934, Cayce stated that indeed imperialism is entering. And in 1938, 18 months before war had officially broken out, and just as Germany annexed Austria, the source became vitriolic on the subject, referring to Germany as a, quote, smear upon its forces for its dominance over its brother, a leech upon the universe for its own sustenance, end quote. In 1939, 3 weeks after Hitler invaded Poland, when asked about Hitler's future, the source answered succinctly, death. So here we got this implication in this particular reading that if all of mankind works together and prays, they can change the outcome of the Hitler future, and that maybe the warning was coming because it seemed unlikely that that was going to happen. Here we have the classic omen, a message about mending ways before it's too late, and about the power of brotherhood and the collective will and prayer. It's all super fascinating, and the intensity of those readings are also interesting, to me anyway. Well, that wasn't the limit of the stuff that Cayce predicted either. He also predicted the beginning and the end of World War II. He predicted the beginning on October 7th of 1935, believe it or not. And in this particular reading, which is reading 416-7, he went on to talk about how the entire world would come to war. And of course, he mentioned the Nazis. He then predicted the end of World War II on August 30th of 1941. Here's a quote from Kirkpatrick's book on that. Cayce gave another decisively clear prediction of the end of World War II. Quote, for through the efforts of the entity, much may be accomplished when in 45 to 46 peace again rules in the earth. Much is to be taken into consideration. Keep ahead in knowing that justice and mercy are the basic principles in dealing with one another, in dealings with groups, in dealings with states and nations, for these are right in the Lord. So that was a full 4 years before the war ended, and where he predicted it would be between 45 and 46, and it actually ended in September of 1945. He also said that it would take, in another reading, I think 2 years for things to return to a state of normalcy, which is a pretty accurate prediction of what happened.
Well, people are going to complain that he didn't nail the exact day of VE, Victory in Europe Day. and Victory in Japan Day, both separately at the hour. But it's still not bad for a civilian with no military secret knowledge.
Yeah. I mean, this is years ahead. So that's a hard thing to call, I would think. How many years this is going to take. I suppose you could say this was all luck, or maybe these readings weren't done in controlled scientific conditions. So how can we know how anecdotal they are? But I just don't get the feeling that they went to all this trouble to make up what was being said in every single one of these over 10,000 readings. So, summarizing a few of these other prophecies that came true, he also predicted the establishment of the United Nations, India's independence from Britain, and the collapse of communism and the Soviet Union. Those are all just throwaway ones. If you want to read them, you can find them. It's pretty fascinating. Additionally, he made a technological prediction of the invention of infrared for night vision, which is pretty amazing. I mean, he specified rays of light, red rays of light, talking about how it could be used. And this was another one of those readings that at the end it has C ? He's like raised to an nth degree in its brilliancy or refractory effect. See, and I feel like it's a James Cagney impression. I'm not sure who was sending that information through, but that's reading 137-38. He gave that reading in 1925 about the infrared. Infrared radiation had been discovered in 1800 by the astronomer Sir William Herschel, but there was no practical use of it until the Germans had a primitive night vision scope called the Zielgerät ZB-1229 Vampire. That was in active combat use in 1945. Still, that was 20 years after this particular reading. Another one of his more famous predictions was the death of 2 U.S. presidents. In this particular reading, he said, "Ye are to have a division in thine own land before there is the second of the presidents that next will not live through his office, a mob rule." That was from reading 3976-2 in 1939. FDR died in office 6 years later, and then JFK was assassinated 18 years after that. The rest of that reading detailed what could easily be interpreted as the social upheaval of the 60s, centered around Vietnam and the discord between the peace movement and capitalism and the military-industrial complex. So it's pretty fascinating. He's calling a lot of shots. A lot of things are happening. When I look back on how much history I've lived through, talk about feeling old, I can't believe that I've lived to see 2 impeachments. That's pretty crazy. I feel like it seems like that should be a once-in-a-lifetime event. Of course, there's people working on the current impeachment of President Trump that's their 3rd impeachment. So that says you've been in office a pretty long time, I guess. But
wait, you weren't alive during, let's see, there's Nixon. What was the first one?
Johnson. No, I wasn't alive. What do you think? I'm 1,000 years old? It was
maybe.
Let's see. I think it was Andrew Johnson. Let me see.
Yes.
Let me look it up right now since you put me on the spot with that.
Well, you should know that if you're going to make a statement like that.
Yes. Impeached. I am right.
Right.
Andrew Johnson
Yes.
was impeached. Yes.
Yeah, no, I know.
So that was 1868. So no, Forrest, I was born 101 years after that. Thank you.
Right. This would be the 3rd formal impeachment process here. The process of impeachment against Richard Nixon started, but he resigned before it was formally completed. That's
right.
correct?
That's correct, because the Supreme Court had ordered him to release the tapes, I think, and 15 Republican senators said, we're going to vote you out. And he was like, okay, I'll leave.
Yes.
So that technically it did start, but he wasn't officially impeached. So there's really only 3 impeachments.
Yeah, that's what I remember as a kid.
So yeah, I've lived through 3, I guess. 3 or 1 almost and 2 for reals.
There you go.
But definitely was not around for Andrew Johnson in 1868, at least not in this body, as Edgar Cayce.
Well, that's another point I was going to make. You may have.
Yeah, maybe I was. I don't remember it though.
As a Southern farmer coming back from
yeah, that's right.
Civil War veteran. Yeah,
that's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Whatever you were back then.
Whatever
you may
I
have.
Was.
Yeah.
So there's one other prophecy that Cayce made that we definitely want to touch on, and that was the fact that he said that Atlantis would be found or would be discovered again.
Oh, yes, Atlantis. Well, that was one of the first books I read on him, and probably the most complete one. There's a ton of books out there about all of his readings and people writing about his life and his impact, and I believe that was maybe the last one I read cover to cover, and it was just a mind-blowing story. It's a great narrative, no matter how you take it or what you want to believe about it. As I have said, if he totally just made it all up, it's great science fiction, I thought. But his story of Atlantis is one of the major points that critics will use against him, saying like, this is crazy, fantastical stuff. What are you talking about here? This is silly. But if you look at some of the ideas that come up in it, They are ideas and technologies that we are verging on today that he was thinking about, or maybe he gleaned it anecdotally from sci-fi he was reading. He was a voracious reader, and people will say, well, there you go. He got those ideas from there. But if you look at some of the technological ideas that come up in it, they're not all that crazy, but it's crazy for back then. And we're going to talk about that in the criticism section here. We have yet to get to.
Yes, it's right around the corner. Just a couple more prophecies I wanted to mention. One of the biggest ones was that he predicted the day of his own death. And this is information I found on Kevin Williams' webpage that we mentioned earlier, where there was that fantastic list of the prophecies, which ones have come true and which haven't. And Kevin, thank you again for permission to cite and use material from your website, along with the Edgar Cayce Foundation that gave us permission to use the readings. But this is pretty fascinating here, because near the end of Cayce's life, he was ailing from pulmonary edema. And in this disease, fluid accumulates in the lungs. He was home and sick, and apparently he had told some folks who had come to visit him, quote, "It is all arranged. I am to be healed on Friday, the 5th of January," end quote. Then, on January 1st, 1945, he announced that he would be buried in 4 days. He died on the 3rd. His funeral was on the 5th. Williams goes on to point out that around 20 years prior to that, Cayce had had a dream that he told folks about where he could see himself immersed in a tub of hot water. That is exactly what death from pulmonary edema feels like. So it's almost like he had a vision about his own future.
Yeah. Point of clarification here, though. When you say, or when he said, "It is all arranged,"
yes,
as a quote, "I am to be healed."
Yes.
So people aren't confused there. He's saying that I am going to be relieved of this human disease that I'm suffering from now.
Yes.
Right? Is that how you take it? And that
yeah,
he
that's
says,
exactly.
I'm going to be healed, meaning I'm going to be whisked away to the spirit world where I won't have to suffer from this anymore.
Yeah, I don't have to worry about this body anymore. And what's wrong with it.
Okay, so I want to clarify that.
Yeah, no, it's good.
Because people are going to say, like, well, he wasn't healed, he died.
Right.
On the 5th. But that's what he meant by, I will be healed from this.
Yeah, and that's probably why he followed it up with a few days later, I'll be buried.
Yes.
Because obviously you don't get healed and then buried, at least not in our current society. So.
Oh, well, back then, remember you had a little bell to ring.
Yes, Saved by the Bell.
Wait a minute, I was healed.
I'm still alive.
Dig me up, please. Yeah.
I'm feeling much better. But P.S., by the way, last thing we should touch on, he also said there's an economic bottom coming in 2032. So I would say invest or divest accordingly. Those folks he told about the 1929 crash ignored him and they lost everything.
Yeah. So always diversify your portfolio holdings.
Yes. He predicted a cycle, and I'm sure there's all kinds of business charts and ways to look at this anyway, even irrespective of psychic abilities. But he saw a cycle that essentially played out every 25 years, and 2032 is the next round on that. So it's interesting.
Yeah, things are cyclical always, I believe, in a lot of fields. And even with this last crash that we experienced in 2008 to 2010, that last market downturn, and a lot of people lost their stuff, I sensed a lot of hubris, and that there were financial analysts saying there's some irrational exuberance here going on. Be careful. And a lot of people saying, that's ridiculous. The market is strong.
Greed is good.
Yeah, put everything you got into it. And they were wrong. And then it's just funny. They came back later and said, like, well, just to clarify, I didn't say that exactly. So there's a lot of pride and hubris, and you got to always protect yourself. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. That's always good advice.
Yes, that is good advice. Hey, I remember when they were talking on the news about the Dow hitting 10,000, and I was young and I didn't understand the stock market at all, but I was like, 10,000, that's a lot. That's a big number. And then yesterday, or the day before we recorded this, it hit 30,000, and it's going to keep going, I guess, because that's what it does, but there will be crashes, and Cayce says one's coming in 2032. So just something to think about, especially when it comes from a guy with a track record. Now, there were other prophecies, again, that haven't come to pass, one of them being, depending on how you look at it, the discovery of Atlantis. We'll get into more detail on that at another time. He also predicted that there would be volcanic activity preceding earthquakes and tsunamis. He also predicted earth changes that would destroy nations. And then he said after that, there would be 1,000 years of a golden age. He predicted that we would find ways to extend human life, which I've been reading articles about that just in the past week. He predicted a city of gold would be discovered in the Gobi Desert. Let's get out there and start digging. He additionally said that a self-fueling perpetual motion machine would be invented. And some people have been working on this and apparently are still working on it to this day. but it hasn't happened yet.
Nazi bell.
Yeah, the Nazi bell. Or it happened and some DARPA group swept it up and disappeared. I think when things like that come out, the military-industrial complex makes them disappear, even if they are here. It's a lot like advancements that they deny until 30 years later when they say they're retiring it. And you're like, oh, you've had that all this time? Yeah. So there's that. And this one, here's one that struck a chord with me personally for some reason. It felt remarkably plausible to me here now in 2020 compared to how it probably felt when he first talked about it 84 years ago. This is a dream. This is not a reading. This is a dream that he had. Forrest, I was wondering if you might read this dream here.
Certainly. And keep in mind, this is not a reading in his sleep-like state. This was a dream when he was fully asleep that he recalled later.
Yes.
I had been born again in 2100 AD in Nebraska. The sea apparently covered all of the western part of the country, as the city where I lived was on the coast. The family name was a strange one. At an early age, as a child, I declared myself to be Edgar Cayce, who had lived 200 years before. Scientists, men with long beards, little hair, and thick glasses, were called in to observe me. They decided to visit the places where I said I had been born, lived, and worked in Kentucky, Alabama, New York, Michigan, and Virginia. Taking me with them, the group of scientists visited these places in a long, cigar-shaped metal flying ship which moved at a high speed. Water covered part of Alabama. Norfolk, Virginia had become an immense seaport. New York had been destroyed either by war or an immense earthquake and was being rebuilt. Industries were scattered over the countryside. Most of the houses were built of glass. Many records of my work as Edgar Cayce were discovered and collected. The group returned to Nebraska, taking the records with them to study.
You know, as a parent, one of the things I feel responsible for is teaching my son good habits when it comes to taking care of his teeth. Of course, he's a kid, so if the toothbrush merely touches one tooth for a second, he's done the job, you know? But it's more important for him to learn good habits now, because later in life, if you face a lot of dental issues, it's not only very painful and always inconvenient, but really, really expensive.
Yeah, learning good habits like brushing for 2 minutes, twice a day, and flossing regularly.
It's hard even for adults to be responsible.
Well, Quip makes having good habits simple for adults and kids.
They really do, and here's how. Your starter set comes with an electric toothbrush from Quip, refillable floss, and an anti-cavity toothpaste.
Well, the Quip brush is very sophisticated and elegant. You know, it has sensitive sonic vibrations with a built-in timer and 30-second pulses to guide you to a full and even clean.
The floss dispenser is my favorite because it comes with pre-marked string to help you use just enough.
Plus, Quip delivers a fresh brush head, floss, and toothpaste refills every 3 months with free shipping.
And as I've said before, it is a very good-looking product.
Oh, very modern and sleek, yes.
Join over 3 million healthy mouths and get Quip today, starting at $25.
It's a great price for this kit. And if you go to getquip.com/legends right now, you'll get your first refill free. That's your first refill free at getquip.com/legends, spelled GETQUIP.com/legends.
Quip, the Good Habits Company.
There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. This insightful quote from Maya Angelou describes the inspiration behind Raquel O'Brien's podcast, Silent Waves. Silent Waves is a compelling 7-part series that brings to life the true story of 26-year-old Raquel O'Brien as she liberates herself from the shadows of childhood sexual abuse. As the family finds the freedom to confront their conflicting versions of Raquel's past through raw and honest conversations with each other, what emerges is a larger, more complex family history.
Produced in collaboration with documentary filmmaker Georgina Savage, Silent Waves was initially independently released in 2018. Consequently, many survivors of abuse reached out to thank Raquel for sharing her story and empowering them to do the same.
The complete 7-part series of Silent Waves is now available to listeners. Reissued by the team at Casefile Presents, a brand new podcasting platform created by Casefile True Crime Podcast to help Raquel's important story reach more listeners across the world.
Find out why reviewers have called Silent Waves powerful, phenomenal, bravely confronting, and a must-listen. Download Silent Waves on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, everyone. I'm Steve, and this is Astonishing Legends. Let's get back to the show.
Well, how many people are talking about rising sea levels today
Rising sea levels,
as compared to back then?
houses made of glass, which seems like he's describing mid-century moderns and contemporary houses.
And there's that old chestnut, the long cigar-shaped metal flying ship moving at high speed.
Maybe that was him that they saw, those pilots Commander Fravor saw off the Nimitz that time. That was Cayce. He was early.
One of his lifetimes.
Yeah.
Right. It's sitting in Wonder Woman's transparent cube enclosed within a orb flying vehicle, whatever that thing was described as, which is pretty far out. But yeah. No, these are all interesting things for someone to say back in the 30s that commonly now we would talk about. And a lot of people are saying, well, there you go. There's rising sea levels. There apparently is LASIK didn't catch on in the future in 2100 AD. They're still wearing thick glasses.
Yeah, I don't know what that is.
But beards are in.
He at one point had recommended smoking regularly, didn't he?
Well, no, let me clarify that. In that
or limiting your smoking to, what did you say? I think you told me this in the course of our research. 8 cigarettes a day?
I was going to address this later, but it's as good a time as any, I believe, because there is some controversy. And yes, for some people, Cayce said a little bit of tobacco was okay. Not beneficial, but maybe not as harmful as it would be for other folks. And I want to make this point in that it is a big point of controversy in some of his readings, in that, yes, nowadays we all know any form of tobacco is not good for you. You shouldn't start it. Don't even think about it. It's not a good thing. Just put that out of your head. And if you are smoking or taking tobacco in any form, you should try and quit. The point here was, during this reading for this specific individual, and I think we have to keep this in mind, this reading was for this particular person and the malady that he had. And what Cayce would do is when he was describing a treatment, he would also give you other health tips as well. Like, this will take care of what you got wrong, and you might want to do this too. And this is, you're doing too much of this, so curb that. And it reminds me a little bit of a statement by Paracelsus, who was a Swiss physician, alchemist, astrologer during the German Renaissance. He was born towards the end of the 1400s, I think 1493, some say 1494 here. But one tip that he gave out that kind of stuck with me, he said that anything you take or ingest can be too much. You can drink too much water or milk. If you drink too much water, you'll get hyperhidrosis. Your brain will swell and you'll die a horrible death. So everything in moderation. That's his point. That was Cayce's point with this gentleman. And in general is that during this reading, which you may hear on YouTube, now this is not a sanctioned clip by them, so we're not going to include it, but you can find it. It is kind of humorous because he does say for this gentleman, as you pointed out, Scott, if you limit yourself to 6 or 8 smokes a day. Now, he didn't say cigarettes or pipe smoking sessions or cigars. He just said 6 or 8 smokes. For this particular person, probably wouldn't be that harmful. Now, we know for some people, like, that would not be good at all. Don't start smoking, certainly. And if you are smoking, you should probably quit. But I wanted to point out here that these readings were for specific individuals and their problems. So this is something I read a long time ago for a health remedy reading where he said natural tobaccos with no additives should not be that harmful for certain individuals. And again, that, I know today that sounds crazy and you shouldn't do that, and it would point him out to be a quack. And what is he doing? That's harmful. Well, just as an anecdotal thing, one of our friends, Scott knows this guy, his great-grandmother, I believe, was in her early 90s, and she was a heavy smoker. And, I mean, she would get up in the middle of the night and have a couple of smokes, and she went to her doctor, and I just remember this anecdote, and she said, well, doctor, you know, I'm getting up there in age. Maybe I should quit smoking. And her doctor said, no. If you quit smoking right now, it'd be such a shock to your system that it's not going to be good for you. So, look, you've lasted this long. You're in your early 90s. Just keep smoking. You know, I know that's crazy again, but his point was that she had gotten used to it in a way. And there you go. And she lived to be in her late 90s and died of natural causes. Again, the smoking wasn't great. So it wasn't like a preservative, but for her, it wasn't that big of a deal. And that's going to sound controversial, but I wanted to make that point about Cayce and some of the things that he claimed were okay for people, probably not great, but if you limit it, everything in moderation. That's the point. And as he calls it, stimulus. Any stimulus to the body that's too much will be harmful.
And the other thing to keep in mind is that Hopkinsville was the international home of dark tobacco at the time. So
well, there you go. He's promoting home products.
Well, observations from multiple sources indicate that Cayce's details of big changes for the Earth and all of that didn't necessarily come to pass, the explosive ones that he was talking about in these prophecies. Although he also had a regular prediction of things happening gradually, and some of that does seem to be happening. Significant major changes that were gradual, not catastrophically sudden. But those predictions and those gradual changes seem to have an air of inevitability about them in the big picture. But there's also this idea that nothing is set in stone. It's like Terminator 2, when Linda Hamilton's like carving in the table there. It's no fate but what we make. And that idea comes up over and over in Cayce's readings. The bottom line is this, and Kevin Williams says it really well on his own website. Quote, Cayce mentioned numerous times how humanity's divine gift of free will had the power to overcome astronomical forces of nature. He also emphasized that the timeline of future events is not fixed or absolutely predetermined. Williams goes on to point out that Matthew chapter 24, verse 36 says that Jesus doesn't even know when he will return. And I'll read that here. But about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father.
That's why I'm always a little dubious, well, always, and more than a little dubious about evangelicals that say, I know when the end days are coming, and then people sell off all their stuff and buy a large motorhome, and I don't know where they're going to go.
Right.
But anybody tells you they know when it's all going to end and you should give them your money
for their RV
and buy a lot of guns. Yeah, that's like, I'd get a second opinion on that.
I'd look at Matthew 24:36, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you would think they would, but they don't seem to. Well, now let's turn to the skeptical viewpoint on Cayce. And I'm sure a lot of listeners who were doubting him from the beginning are wondering when we're going to get to this, because it seems we've been very favorable, but we've been trying to take a middle road here and make our own comments throughout this, and you can certainly have your own viewpoints, but there is a definite skeptical viewpoint about Cayce's abilities, what he said, his legacy, and whether it was good or not, and accurate and authentic. And it's valid, and we should look at this. So, Scott, why don't you lead us off here in addressing the skeptical viewpoint?
Well, I'm going to start out with a completely unsubstantiated observation, and I'm going to say that it seems that there are as many skeptics of Cayce's talents as there are believers, which is often the case with any sort of high-profile legend like this. It's something we've discovered in the years that we've been doing this now. And because we like to cover all the angles, we would be seriously remiss if we didn't address the skeptical viewpoint. Now, I want to reiterate that even though our show trends towards wanting to believe, and our trade is in sharing these legends with you because we know that you guys find it interesting, we are also strong proponents of critical thinking. And while I can't speak for you, Forrest, I have to remind myself to be as unbiased as I can be when I start thinking about all the conclusions I've reached on a story, because most of the time, by the time I'm done researching it, I have arrived at an opinion, even if I can't clarify it or nail it down 100%. So at the end
or very well.
Yeah, or very well, like the sentence I just said. But at the end of a show, I can consider my opinion informed, but it really only just barely qualifies as that. So we're pretty good at sounding like we know what we're talking about after a self-imposed immersion course on it. But you have to remember, it's just that, an immersion course. We only have a few weeks of knowledge on the topic at hand, at best, usually. And the only thing we can claim up to 5 years of now is an overarching knowledge of the big picture and patterns in humanity that we've begun to realize that we're seeing with every story, common ground. So you could probably say we're learning more about how people react to and deal with these legends on all sides than we're learning about any given legend itself. So now that we've devoted the bulk of this series to all the stories about Cayce with not too much criticism of his methods and the veracity of his work, let's take a look at that side of the coin. Now, we can take our pick of pretty much any skeptic out there because they all have something to say about Edgar Cayce. For this series, I thought we'd go with one of our favorite skeptical websites, the Skeptics Dictionary, or skepdic.com. That's skepdic.com. Skeptic is an impressive website maintained by Dr. Robert Todd Carroll. And Dr. Carroll's bio states that he was a full-time teacher in philosophy at Sacramento City College from 1977 until he retired in 2007. And the Skeptic website dates back 25 years to 1994, which is pretty impressive. Again, this gentleman has been looking at the opposite side of the Astonishing Legends coin for 20 years before we even got started. He has extensive knowledge in critical thinking and has even published a book called Becoming a Critical Thinker. And more recently, The Critical Thinker's Dictionary, which I just purchased yesterday.
Aha, he's out to make money off skepticism. See, you shouldn't believe him.
That's
man.
right. He's seeking fame and fortune from being skeptical. But Dr. Carroll has a great page on the skeptic's viewpoint on Cayce, and we have a link to that page in our show notes, but I want to share some of his observations here. One of the first things that he points out is that even though Cayce left behind 30,000 transcripts of sessions, they, quote, provide no way of distinguishing what Cayce discerned by psychic ability from information provided to him by his assistants, by letters from patients, or by simple observation. In short, the only evidence for Cayce's psychic doctoring is useless for testing his psychic powers, end quote. And that's Dr. Carroll actually quoting Dale Beyerstein. Beyerstein is a philosopher who has taught at Malaspina College, Douglas College, Kwantlen College, the University of British Columbia, and Langara College. Dale is a co-founder of the BC Skeptics and director-at-large of that foundation. Dr. Carroll goes on to state that beliefs in Cayce's abilities are essentially based on anecdotes and testimonials. He adds that there's no proof whatsoever that cures were the product of psychic powers rather than the placebo effect. And this takes me down a whole other road. And I already said this earlier, the placebo effect, right? And this is something I wanted to drill down a little bit on. And I was looking on the internet for a good way to describe the placebo effect. I think everybody has a superficial familiarity with it, but I found this webpage, www.health.harvard.edu. This is a Harvard website, and it talks about the power of the placebo effect. I just want to read a couple of sections here, and of course, you and I can talk about it a little bit after this. And these are excerpted. This is mostly continuous. I'm trying not to take anything too far out of context. The placebo effect is more than positive thinking. Believing a treatment or procedure will work. It's about creating a stronger connection between the brain and body and how they work together, says Professor Ted Kapchuk of Harvard-affiliated Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, whose research focuses on the placebo effect. Placebos won't lower your cholesterol or shrink a tumor. Instead, placebos work on symptoms modulated by the brain, like the perception of pain. Quote, placebos may make you feel better, but they will not cure you, end quote, says Kapchuk. They have been shown to be most effective for conditions like pain management, stress-related insomnia, and cancer treatment side effects like fatigue and nausea. That's again a quote. How placebos work is still not quite understood, but it involves a complex neurobiological reaction that includes everything from increases in feel-good neurotransmitters, like endorphins and dopamine, to greater activity in certain brain regions linked to moods, emotional reactions, and self-awareness. All of it can have therapeutic benefit. Quote, the placebo effect is a way for your brain to tell the body what it needs to feel better, end quote, says Kapchuk. But placebos are not all about releasing brain power. You also need the ritual of treatment. Quote, when you look at these studies that compare drugs with placebos, there is the entire environmental and ritual factor at work. You have to go to a clinic at certain times and be examined by medical professionals in white coats. You receive all kinds of exotic pills and undergo strange procedures. All this can have a profound impact on how the body perceives symptoms because you feel you are getting attention and care, end quote. And I would cite whoever wrote that entry, but it's not on the webpage there. But we do have a link to this webpage. Again, that's a Harvard webpage, and Professor Kapchuk actually studies the placebo effect. So, of course, I mean, what do you think about that? I think there's something to be said for that. And I want to go further into this as we move forward here. But there's something to be said for the idea that people felt, especially if they were coming up short with traditional Western medicine, that if they went and they saw this man who was something of a miracle worker, he's laying down, he's giving this advice that seems to come from another world, whether or not the advice is working or a portion of how well it works may be based on the fact that they believe that they're receiving miraculous advice. What do you think about that?
Well, I say if the placebo effect works, why not placebo it to death? Yeah. That was probably the wrong way to say that.
I think you would placebo it to life.
Right. No, my point is that that was a key factor, what you just read there, in that the placebo effect usually has the effect of making you feel better, alleviating some symptoms, but not curing you.
Right.
Now, I want to know more about that statement. Is that totally true? Has the placebo effect actually cured or reversed some conditions and maladies? Because I do believe personally that there is a very strong link to the mind-body connection there, and that the mind can be a miraculous, mysterious thing that can do all sorts of things, especially for one's own condition. I know that you can make yourself sick, and in failing health if you're harboring the wrong thoughts. That also is a self-fulfilling prophecy type of condition where, yeah, you can definitely make yourself sick. You can make yourself better. So the problem with the Cayce treatments, I think, and that would be also with the medical community, is that, yeah, it's a very anecdotal. They, as we did mention in part 2, they tried to do that a little bit when he was giving public readings and following up with people and compiling a compendium of these cases, but the medical community would say, and perhaps rightly so, that it's anecdotal. You have to be in strict laboratory conditions with thousands of participants tracked over decades before it can really be taken seriously by the scientific community. And that's the way they operate. Those are their standards, and they seem to be pretty decent standards. So in the case of Cayce, it's hard to tell whether these people initially felt better and then the malady returned, but you can look at Cayce's own life and his throat condition. He did seem to be able to cure himself for a while until things like stress and his own self-doubts, I believe, brought back that losing of his voice problem.
Which is theoretically psychosomatic in the first place. But, you know,
that's what the voice told him, that this is psychosomatic to a degree. You are bringing this on yourself. And until you can fix that.
But you still require a physical cure or an activity. It's like stress cardiomyopathy, which is the broken heart syndrome, which is a real thing, but they can't figure out really how it works, where maybe a spouse passes away and the other one passes closely after. It is dying of a broken heart.
That is also the case with Cayce.
Yeah, that's right.
His wife Gertrude passed away 3 months later. Was she also feeling like, well, I'm done too. My duties here on earth with my husband, we're kind of done. I miss him, and I'm going to go join him. Whatever the case, that's more of a personal thing. Maybe the family knows, but you can see it recently with Debbie Reynolds and Carrie Fisher, where Carrie Fisher's brother, said that her mom wasn't that sad. She just missed Carrie and she wanted to be with her.
Yeah.
And very soon after, she passed away. Is that what's taking place there?
Well, Dr. Carroll goes on to point out on his website that, quote, "It is true, however, that many people consider themselves cured by Cayce, and that's enough evidence for true believers. It works. The fact that thousands don't consider themselves cured or can't rationalize an erroneous diagnosis won't deter the true believer." Gardner, who I'll explain who that is here in a little bit, notes that Dr. J.B. Rhine, famous for his ESP experiments at Duke University, was not impressed with Cayce. Rhine felt that a psychic reading done for his daughter didn't fit the facts. Now, defenders of Cayce claim that if a patient has any doubts about Cayce, the diagnosis won't be a good one. Yet what reasonable person wouldn't have doubts about such a man, no matter how kind or sincere he was? And Cayce's defenders provide some classic ad hoc hypotheses to explain away their hero's failures. For example, Cayce and a famous dowser named Henry Gross set out together to discover buried treasure along the seashore and found nothing. Their defenders suggested that their psychic powers were accurate because either there was once a buried treasure where they looked, but it had been dug up earlier, or there would be a treasure buried there sometime in the future. And Dr. Carroll goes on to say parenthetically, one wonders why their psychic powers didn't discern this. We're going to explain this away, and I'm going to say right now, that's something that I know I'm personally guilty of on our own show, not because I'm trying to convince people that something that's hard to wrap your head around is true when it looks like it isn't, but more because it is, frankly, just how my mind works. I do wonder, because of the things that we've seen and studied, I do wonder sometimes if something doesn't look true or seems false on the surface, how can you know that I'm literally doing exactly what Carol's talking about here?
What's that?
Well, maybe it happened before and it's gone. Maybe there was a treasure and somebody already dug it up, or it's going to happen in the future. I do this. I know that I do this, and I'm admitting to it. But conversely, I still have a little bit of faith in that idea that just because a mistake is made, it doesn't categorically deny what's happening. That's, and I don't know there's no way to scientifically defend that position. And
right.
I get that.
Well, as we described in his life narrative, that whenever he did try to do something for financial gain, it didn't seem to work. So it didn't work on 2 occasions, or in 2 areas here, where if you weren't really buying into it, and maybe that is that mind-body link connection that must be established. If you didn't really buy into this stuff, it's not going to work for you. You can go through the motions and maybe you get some relief, but you're not going to be receiving the total benefit of it. And throughout his life story, that happened all the time, especially in the mid to later years, where he agreed to try and find buried treasure or provide He was trying to raise money for the hospital, so he got into partnership with those oil men from Texas, and that didn't work. So what can you surmise from that? And that, well, if you're trying to use it for something of just making money, it doesn't work.
Yeah, that's what he said he found himself. And yeah, finding the treasure may have been something that wouldn't work out because it is about personal gain.
Yeah, it doesn't need to be found. I mean, finding buried treasure really just makes you rich, unless it's something of knowledge. And we'll talk about this when we discuss Atlantis, and that there is a buried storehouse of knowledge, supposedly. Now, discovering that is beneficial to humanity, not just making a few folks rich. So there are stipulations, apparently, to what this knowledge and ability can be used for. And speaking of Atlantis, I just want to mention briefly here that something skeptic Robert Todd Carroll goes over in the Skeptics Dictionary, saying that Cayce is one of the main people responsible for some of the sillier notions about Atlantis. And yeah, when we talk about it, as we're going to, you could say that's really silly and far out and crazy, wacky stuff. It's 50s sci-fi. It's baloney. How could you even consider that? Well, what does Robert Todd Carroll know about Atlantis? It's a fictional place, isn't it? That's what a lot of people believe. It didn't exist at all. It was just mentioned by some ancient Greek historians, possibly in an oral narrative. There's no proof of Atlantis existing at all. So that's also kind of a silly statement, I think, about Atlantis, and that we're also looking at it as much as Mr. Carroll is that, well, Atlantis would be like the ancient Greeks, right? They're all mucking about wearing togas and sandals and espousing on this and that, and they're not very advanced. Well, how would he know? Was he there? And I'm making a joke, of course, but
Yeah.
it's like, what's sillier here? You're talking about what the reality is of a fictional place that might be or may not have existed, or what you think it should have been like. And so two of the things that Carroll mentioned about being kind of wacky and silly was Cayce's mention of Atlantis using solar power in combination with crystals that was used to power the whole island. I believe it was still an island there. And that in 1958, Cayce apparently predicted that the United States would discover a death ray that had been used on Atlantis. And so those are just two examples that Carroll believes are pretty silly. Well, the death ray, that was being kicked around in the 1920s and 30s by such people as Edwin R. Scott and other notables, Marconi, and of course, Nikola Tesla. And he said it wasn't a ray, it was more of a beam, so get that straight. But that's not a new idea. That certainly could have been picked up by Cayce at some point, but there were serious people that were working on it, and you wouldn't know what the military has acquired or discovered because they're not going to let you know. So my point here is that some of the things that he came up with nowadays wouldn't maybe seem all that crazy because there are more fantastical things that science is currently working on that we're just now beginning to hear about.
Well, Dr. Carroll goes on to state that folks that believe in Cayce's reading cite the fact that he couldn't have known all the things he did, medically and otherwise, without the knowledge coming from an outside source. But Cayce worked in bookstores and loved to read, especially occult and osteopathic works. He further cites Martin Gardner, who we mentioned a minute ago, who famously wrote a book entitled Fads and Fallacies in the Name of Science. This came out in 1952. This book is a touchstone for the modern skeptic movement. Fads and Fallacies in the Name of Science was originally published in 1952 as In the Name of Science, an entertaining survey of the high priests and cultists of science, past and present. It was Martin Gardner's second work, this is from Wikipedia, a survey of what it described as pseudosciences and cult beliefs. It became a founding document in the nascent scientific skepticism movement. Michael Shermer said of it, quote, modern skepticism has developed into a science-based movement beginning with Martin Gardner's 1952 classic. So that's off the Wikipedia page there. Dr. Carroll points out that Gardner refers to one of Cayce's readings regarding Gertrude's tuberculosis, Gertrude being Cayce's wife. This is from a 1957 printing of Gardner's book on page 217. Quote, from the head, pains along through the body from the second, fifth, and sixth dorsals, and from the first and second lumbar, tie-ups here, floating lesions or lateral lesions in the muscular and nerve fibers, which supply the lower end of the lung and the diaphragm, in conjunction with the sympathetic nerve of the solar plexus, coming in conjunction with the solar plexus at the end of the stomach. So there's portions of that reading that qualify as incorrect diagnoses. That's what Carroll is saying. They are technically diagnostic misses. So some of the information is right. much of it is wrong. And this is a brief overview of Carroll's position, and I think it well represents the skeptical position on Cayce in general. So, I mean, and now we should talk about this, Forrest. I mean, what do you think?
Well, I certainly don't have enough medical knowledge to even should be commenting on this, and as from a layperson's point, though, yeah, I don't know what he's talking about, of course.
Yeah.
That's what I get from a lot of the readings is that you'll read them and it's not clear. As I said at the beginning of our series here, in that they seem vague. You're not really sure exactly what he's talking about, and that's a criticism in that if you're going to make a claim, a prediction, a remedy, a medical diagnosis, a prophecy, people want you to be explicitly clear, and they want you to be 100% right all the time, because most people don't have much use for somebody who's right half the time. Even though that might be amazing, 50% of the time you might get some pretty far out prophecies correct. That's pretty incredible, but I think the skeptical side would want 100% correct. I don't know how much is good enough. 90% correct all the time, 80%, how much would impress them? I believe Hugh Lynn Cayce, when they did a study, they claimed that their father's readings were above 80% accurate, I believe. So if you look specifically at the case of Gertrude's tuberculosis, maybe most of the diagnosis was incorrect. On the other hand, she seems to have been healed. Now, we don't know, is that the placebo effect? Not just making her feel better, but actually providing a cure. Was it that powerful that she believed her husband's abilities? And as we know from the narrative, she started off being very dubious about these readings. They both were. So did she come around and it actually had some effect? Did she just get better on her own? Was that even possible? We don't have enough details nowadays to be able to look at this and say definitely it was due to Cayce's readings. And even though they were 60% off the mark, the 40% there was enough to cure her, and whatever they did as a restorative treatment actually worked. So it's all too vague, is my point, to actually nail this down. But on the other hand, I would say it's very hard to argue with success, although a lot of people will.
Well put.
Well, I think whatever you believe about Edgar Cayce, he gave a lot of people hope during his lifetime, and his legacy continues to do so with the foundation. And as I always say, look at the overall message. Was it something where it seems to be negative, where like, sell off all your earthly possessions, give the money to me, we're going to buy a bunch of guns and get a compound?
Or I get a big, big house and 23 Rolls Royces.
Yes, that
it's the classics. Yeah, give all your money to God. Here's my address.
Yeah, and with the person justifying it, saying, well, God wants me to have this, and that's why you should do it. And there's a lot of people that will give into that. If you look at Cayce's message to the world, it's all positive. Of course, there might be some criticisms. Someone we know indirectly, Karen Stolznow, of the Monster Talk podcast with our friend Blake Smith, who they're both hosts of that show. Go check that out.
It's a great show, yeah.
Yeah, it's a great show and blog for the skeptical, rational side of a lot of these arguments and things that we cover. And one thing Karen Stolznow would say is that his treatments were based basically on hearsay, folk remedies, anecdotal kind of things that he may have picked up, and they were maybe at best useless. At the worst, they could be dangerous. And again, tobacco use may be pointed to that as like, well, whoa, hold on, we shouldn't be doing that at all. That's way off the mark. And another criticism that a lot of skeptics would bring up is that, yeah, maybe Gertrude was cured, but he couldn't cure his own cousin, and he couldn't cure his own baby son, and he passed away. But if you remember from what we said earlier, it's believed from Cayce's supporters and probably Cayce himself that the diagnosis and treatment for his own baby son was not given due consideration, and that possibly led to the demise of their son. So that's an argument that supporters would say, well, there you go. He didn't follow his own advice. And that's something the critics would say, well, he couldn't save his own son. So, and then another thing that critics point out is that he provided diagnoses for people that had already passed away. And I don't know if those were thrown at him to try and trip him up or prove that he was a fraud. But I believe it's hard to say if this is a voice coming from somewhere else, some other intelligence that is not from the earthly plane, what they're actually looking at. Does his soul live on? And therefore, it's really hard to pin down. But aside from all that, I do believe there are things that Cayce brought up in his lifetime that exist in his legacy that introduced the Western world, at least, the United States specifically, that are more spiritual things that are not only just fun to talk about, but might open up your thinking a little bit. So, Scott, I was going to ask you, what do you think about some of these concepts here, like auras and soulmates and using dream interpretation and developing your psychic intuition? Is it all hogwash?
I don't know. I guess I don't think there's a lot of danger in exploring it, really. And I think in a lot of cases it can have a positive side to it. I've always been fascinated with auras. I don't really understand them. But I think, again, going back to the psychic that saw me at John Cryer's house, I think she said that I said something about my aura in that session. I believe in soulmates. I 1,000% believe in that. I believe that that is a thing. And I also am fond of dream interpretation, or trying to figure out what dreams mean beyond just a scrambled thing happening in your brain when you're sleeping. I do feel like there's some significance to them, and that there's a relationship between the conscious and the subconscious. And I believe in the possibility of a global subconscious, I think. And that's based on all the things that we've uncovered over the past several years. And as far as developing psychic ability, I guess I feel like that's something that everybody maybe wants to do or would like to be able to do. But my jury is still out on whether or not that's nature or nurture, the psychic ability thing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure.
Developing it. Does it exist at all? Do you believe that it's a real thing?
Yes, I do believe it's a real thing. I believe that we have met people that I believe are psychic, and I believe we've studied cases of people that clearly were pulling information that they shouldn't have been able to acquire without contact or knowledge of things that then turned out to be true. Yes, I absolutely believe that there's something to psychic abilities. Whether or not we all have them and can develop them, I don't know. But yeah. So,
well, that's what it said, is that we all have that a little bit of ability, that it has to be fine-tuned, though, and that it's like singing. Some people have natural ability. Some have to be trained. Some people will always be tone deaf.
That's me. When it comes to singing, that's me. Yeah.
You can utter a note. It just might be an unpleasant one. Well, anyway, that's all very interesting. I was more curious to hear what your thoughts on it, because I'm sure that has changed since 5-6 years ago when we started talking about this stuff. I asked you about that kind of stuff back then, and I think your needle's moved a little bit.
The needle has moved. That's what you always say. Has my needle moved? Yes.
No, you know what? Where you got that is somebody asked you that about me a few years ago, if your needle had moved, and then they asked you if my needle had moved, and you said no. It's just stuck in place, rusted, solid there. Well, it does. I will say, though, that some things do kind of expand your knowledge about different things, and you develop a philosophical approach to a lot of these things that we look at. It all boils down to philosophy. And regarding Cayce and what you believe about him, I think it comes down to two areas. One is, of course, the major thing is the medical arena and his treatments and cures, and does that work, and is it harmful? And like the psychic things that you just talked about, it's all very personal. I remember when you first did that show and you said that you had gone to a psychic. I remember we got a letter saying that guy said, as soon as Scott mentioned that, like, I'm out.
Right.
Like, you guys that's just dumb. You went to a psychic. I don't want to hear about that. That doesn't work.
Well, I mean, she was at a party. It was free.
Yeah. It's a party trick.
Not like I got in the car and went somewhere and handed over $30, you know?
Well, my point, it's all a very personal experience, and that's what I believe about supernatural stuff. You can believe or don't. Until you have an experience, you won't really know, and then you might accept it and you might deny it, and you might not know what to think about it. But it's, again, a very personal thing. Same thing with the readings for these health treatments, and that it's very specifically tuned to some people. But as we said before, some cures seem to work in a more general sense, and that's why they offer them to the public, in that it might help you, but always be cautious. So my basic thing about medicine is that, I always check with your doctor first. That's what we're always going to say. That's what I believe. Check with your doctor first. If you want to try some herbal remedy, something homeopathic, check with them first to make sure that for you, it's not going to be harmful. And on the flip side of that, I've been prescribed medications that I know had zero effect on me. One of them is a medication that's prescribed for a cough. It had zero effect on me. Did it harm me? Well, not that I can tell. If you kept taking it, maybe it would. But as far as my attitude about natural remedies versus pharmaceuticals is that, yes, always check with your doctor first. Make sure that it's not going to harm you. And then you have to determine for yourself, does it work? Maybe it's placebo, maybe not. Maybe you're just wasting your money. But in the argument for that, I think I'd rather take something that was considered more natural than something that has to be advertised on TV as may cause nausea, vomiting, severe headaches, rashes, diarrhea. uncontrollable movements, mood swings, and thoughts of suicide.
My favorite is
that last one always catches me.
Yeah, that one and fecal urgency. That's a problem. I don't want fecal urgency.
If you're taking anything that might have that, you have to decide for yourself, is the medication worth it? Because I know from some relatives who have had to take a lot of medication that the side effects really start to affect that quality of life issue. And that, okay, maybe it's helping this, but I feel so awful and I have to take 8 other medications, which give me a whole round of other things that are happening to me. I'm not sure it's worth it. And so always get a second opinion. That's a big thing. So my point here is that Western medicine is also not infallible. You have to decide for yourself. Now, when it comes to the prophecy side of this, who knows how it all works on the other side? I'm thinking of Mothman prophecies, right, Scott? Where we were discussing, why is it so hard for these super intelligent entities to make accurate predictions about when exactly something is going to happen? Can't they tell us? Maybe it doesn't work like that. Maybe time is hard to gauge on the other side. So they can tell us, well, if you keep going like you will, as Cayce would say, then this is probably going to happen. Now, you can change that if you change your behavior, become decent folks, not fight with each other, or some things might be inevitable, but I know from a prophecy standpoint, people are not satisfied with 80%. They want 100% accuracy. They want to know right to the minute when something is going to happen. And like under scientific conditions, they want to be able to put you in a lab under scientific conditions and have you be 100% accurate. I think then mainstream science would pay attention to this stuff. And even then, if you were 100% accurate, people are going to deny it. So, but it made me think about, what is it about time? As you said something earlier, Scott, earlier in the show, there was a quote that a lot of people think comes from Albert Einstein, and that is, the only reason for time is so that everything doesn't happen at once. And so I looked that up on a great site. It's called Quote Investigator, and they say that there is no substantive evidence that Einstein wrote or spoke that statement, but it might come from a short story titled The Girl in the Golden Atom by Ray Cummings. That came out in 1919. So after the turn of the century, a lot of these big ideas were being bandied about, and Cayce was right there, active during that time. Maybe he was picking that up by osmosis as well.
I love big ideas. Hey, what's the big idea?
There's a lot of big ideas happening then. And that's when Einstein was operating as well, and he was introducing things that people didn't believe until they were mathematically proved, and they were just uncertain, but they were new ideas. So thinking about how time works and maybe why prophecy doesn't work, this is a huge stretch here, but just, again, something philosophical I was thinking about. Maybe, like the Buddhist principle, everything is happening at once. There is no past. There is no future. There is only now, just this moment. And it is something that I know is impossible for most of us to wrap our heads around, because we're not coming at it with any kind of experiential reference point. We don't even know how to think about that or what it would feel like. Maybe a ghost experience on the other side where they don't feel the passage of time. It's all just one long now. But if it is all bunched up together and it is all happening now, then it does depend on our free will, perhaps. And there are an infinite number of Scott Philbricks out there making an infinite number of choices, and everything has happened with you. Mind blown. Everything that was going to happen, that could possibly happen, has happened, and it happened at one point, and it's still, you're in that moment where it's all just happening. So it's a little too loose is what I'm saying for prophecy. It's not going to be 100%, and sometimes it is, and that's when it freaks people out. You're talking about psychics earlier. I have had people who had, I believe, psychic ability tell me things that, again, I didn't even know them very well, and in some cases not at all, and they told me a few things, and they were spot on, and that grabs your attention. When it happens to you, it will make you think, how did this person possibly know that? They don't know me. They didn't look this up on the internet. A lot of this happened pre-internet when I was younger, and it was like, whoa, you don't know where it comes from, but it's coming from somewhere. So in the case of prophecy, the things that were off the mark for Cayce, it's like, well, maybe they're still going to happen. Maybe they happen in another timeline. We don't know. But I think that before people really start to look to him, yeah, they're going to want some things to hit 100%. So in summation about Cayce here, in my viewpoint, is that if you look at the two areas here of medical diagnoses and predictions of things to come, this thought might work for all those arenas, and that if his remedies didn't work as much as people claim they did, he wouldn't have been as sought after then or as studied to this day. I think he would have been more of a footnote in quack history and quackery. So maybe there is something to these cures coming from some other place, this other side. Is pseudoscience a fair term? Probably for some of this kind of stuff, maybe not for all of it. Because as we've often examined on this show, I believe there are forces that operate outside the boundaries of known science, which appear to cause a noticeable effect. And Cayce was always open to having licensed medical practitioners become involved in his process rather than hide from it. And when it comes to Edgar Cayce and prophecy, I think, like I believe about a lot of the medical readings, they're a little bit vague for me personally. I don't exactly know what he's talking about. You can understand his cures and how to make them. He was pretty clear about that. But as far as what was going on inside your body, like, I don't know, that might be a personal thing between you and your doctor. When it comes to the readings on prophecy and predictions he made, I think, yes, some of it is pretty vague. I have a hard time reading it and getting my head wrapped around it, trying to figure out exactly what he was talking about. But if you look at history and what actually did happen, some things line up enough for me anyway, that I believe he was in the ballpark. And the things that have not yet come to pass, where people say, well, he was way off the mark on this, I think we're just going to have to wait and see. So what do you think, Scott?
Well, I guess my final conclusion here is I had to step back and look at this story overall, and I want to reiterate that we're going to talk about Cayce one more time next week, specifically about Atlantis. But before we get to that, I wanted to give a big picture view of where I was at after these 2 episodes that we've already done. And, since my Sally House experience, there's been a small but persistent flow of comments on social media and the odd email accusing me of having become too open-minded, for lack of a better descriptor.
You should be closed-minded. How dare you?
I know, right? Well, it's true. My belief system has shifted a bit since we started the show. It wasn't just the Sally House experience that did that, though, and I want people to understand that. The Sally experience was a prominent component of a shift in my thinking, but that change has really come from the sum total of all the things we've covered and what we've learned along the way. So there's that. However, the pre-Sally House Scott still lives within me, and I still have a healthy amount of skepticism with regard to the claims associated with a lot of stories. The change in my thinking relates more to concluding that it's okay if there are things we don't understand, and also that we don't need to always draw a line between point A and point B with a story like this. You can put all the labels you want on the school of thought you use to approach a story like this. You can say Cayce wasn't psychic at all, there is no Akashic record, and that it's all a bunch of hooey, as one contemporaneous skeptic described it. But that doesn't change the fact that there are people that believed in Cayce and also believed that they were healed by his advice. Even if all those cases can be described as anecdotal and unprovable, it's pretty clear there were people who sought his help out and felt that what he did for them saved them. Was it a placebo effect? Maybe. But if it was, that's just as miraculous as what he claimed to do. I mean, you can label Cayce a fraud and say it was all the placebo effect. Great. What have you accomplished with that? Nothing. You've simply shifted your need for cognitive closure from one unknown to another that is much more scientifically acceptable. It's nomenclature. We still don't know how this works, but we've classified it. Down with pseudoscience. It's the placebo effect. Well, they don't understand the placebo effect either. So whether or not what Cayce was doing was real is hard to know, I suppose. I don't think we get to know the real answer to most of the stories we cover. And coming back to my shift in thinking since we started, I'm fine with that. My need to prove this unexplainable thing is happening, and this is exactly how, has passed. But my desire to know all the details of what occurred is as strong as it ever was. The one thing I'm absolutely certain of is that Cayce was a kind and generous man who did not set out in search of fame or fortune and who had no intention of defrauding anyone. I believe that he believed that what he was doing was helping people. And I also believe that this story has a lot of packaging on it. I think it's easy to wrap it up in his faith, and maybe that really was at the root of it, but there's a part of me that believes things like this can happen for what even the diehard skeptics would have to eventually admit was a scientific reason. It just might be one that we don't understand yet. But I think the skeptical approach to things we don't understand is aggressively dismissive, and that doesn't do anyone any good either. The conversation ends here because this is the limit of our understanding. Still, I'm moving the goal line. I recognize that. I was personally struck by Thomas Segru's portrayal in his book There Is a River of Cayce as believing that all medicines and sciences should be applied to issues that people might be having. Cayce believed in Western medicine and osteopathy, as well as holistic medicine, and that they could be used concurrently, independently, or in whatever way possible. And he suggested that maybe it would all work better if rather than all parties being dismissive of each other, they worked together. Another passage that really stood out to me in Segru's book was this one, and this is an exchange between Edgar and his son Hugh Lynn, and I'll leave you with it tonight. Every time a thought goes through your head, it changes your whole being. Some thoughts change you only a little. Some thoughts change you a great deal, but all of them change you. Your conscious mind compares every new experience and every new thought with all the experiences and thoughts of a related nature which you've had in this life. Your subconscious mind, the soul mind, compares every new experience and thought with every related experience and thought you've had in all your lives. And beyond that, the superconscious mind, the awareness of your spirit, compares every new experience and thought with truth, the law itself. But what you are going to experience and think is affected by what you have already experienced and thought. For instance, you experience something, your conscious mind makes its comparison and judgment, your subconscious mind makes its comparison and judgment, and your superconscious mind makes its comparison and judgment. As a result of these comparisons and judgments, you, as a whole, adopt an attitude, an opinion, or a feeling about the experience. It may take a little time. For a few days, the judgment of your conscious mind will be uppermost. Then, after what you call reflection, a more reasonable long-range opinion is adopted. And finally, after a period of understanding, a wise, detached, universal opinion prevails. But that's not the end either. All your future experiences and thoughts which are related to this experience influence your attitude toward it, your opinion. So while your past is continually influencing you, you are continually influencing your past. Your past, your present, and your future all change from day to day, from minute to minute, from thought to thought. That's going to wrap up part 2 of our 3-part series on Edgar Cayce. We'll be back next week with part 3, focusing on his readings about the lost city of Atlantis. A reminder that permission has been granted by the Edgar Cayce Foundation to share the portions of his readings that we quoted in tonight's show. The readings are the property of the foundation and copyrighted in 1971 as well as from 1993 to 2007. All rights reserved.
Please remember to support our sponsors. They help keep the show free and the lights on in Blanket Fortiana.
Special thanks to John Bolin.
Hi, I'm Steve, and I give permission to Astonishing Legends to use my voice however they see fit, galaxy-wide, in perpetuity.
Tonight's show was edited by Chris Potter at rumblejar.com and co-produced by Tess Feifel, who is also our head of research.
Our theme, which is available as a ringtone, was composed by Judson Crane, and our sound design and additional composing is by Ryan McCullough.
Special thanks to the Astonishing Research Corps.
But most importantly, we want to thank you, our listeners. Visit our store at astonishinglegends.com or interact with us and other listeners on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
You can also support the show at patreon.com/astonishinglegends, where patrons have access to additional bonus content. No part of this show may be reproduced anywhere without permission. Copyright Astonishing Legends Productions.
Good night.